These are individuals that are grapple with mounting precarity that are driven by both murky geopolitical tensions, but also by uncertain political futures. So this sense of precarity are deeply ingrained in how young adults make decisions, especially as they aspire to what kind of futures that they want to have.
Hi, everyone. Welcome to today's webinar. The topic today is youth unemployment in China today. My name is Andrew Liu. I teach history at Villanova University near Philadelphia. And I'm very excited today to welcome two renowned scholars of contemporary Chinese society to discuss this important but complex topic. So the first is Zhou, who is an assistant professor of sociology at the University of Michigan. She researches as a social demographer and as a family sociologist. And secondly is Eli Friedman, a professor of global labor and work at the School of Industrial and Labor Relations at Cornell University. So thanks to both of you for being here today. Yeah, so why don't we start kind of with some table setting and some basic details for the topic we're going to discuss today. So maybe to start with Eli, what are the latest figures or latest trends for understanding youth unemployment today? Either, numbers or trends in general. And along with that, maybe you could kind of locate today's trends relative to a few years ago. A few years ago, there was a lot of headlines about overwork in China, about the youth, young people in China being burnt out. There's a lot of coverage of, lying flat, 躺平, and so on. Where do we stand today relative to when these trends began to make the headlines a few years ago?
Thanks so much, Andy, for this, and excited about the conversation. The youth unemployment rate, which is people aged 16 to 24 right now, is just below 15%. And it's gone up and down over the last couple of years. But I think the moment it first began to catch headlines was during the pandemic when it really spiked. And at the time, the kind of common understanding, I think, in China, but also internationally, was that this was a temporary sort of a thing that was due to the COVID lockdowns, which people are probably familiar with, were of course much stricter in China than they were in many other places, and restricted the economy in some pretty severe sorts of ways. And so the general expectation was that China has these severe lockdowns that are happening. Eventually, the pandemic's going to be over. The economy is going to come roaring back to life, and we'll go back to the good old days. And of course, we now know that that's not what happened, and that became quite clear by the summer of 2023. Right. So the lockdowns end the end of 2022. 6 months later, in June of 2023, the youth unemployment rate hits 21.3%. And people are kind of freaking out about this. Of course, the young people who don't have jobs are very anxious about it, but the government is as well. And so the National Bureau of Statistics announces that they're going to stop releasing data on youth unemployment, which doesn't make young people happy. There's a lot of discourse, I think, in China at the time, appropriately, that the government seems to be more interested in covering the problem up rather than figuring out a proper solution to it. But in any event, they came up with some explanation that they needed a new kind of methodology and tried to justify it on kind of social scientific grounds. And so they stopped reporting it for about 6 months. And at the end of the year, they came up with a new metric, and they released the numbers. And at the time, at the end of 2023, early 2024, it was also around just below 15%. So basically, over the last year and a half, it's remained, I guess, down from where it had been, although we can debate the methodology that they're using. But more or less been stable at this pretty high and I think uncomfortable number for many people. So yeah, so that's been the basic dynamic over the last couple of years.
Thanks. And maybe we can go further and break down like what is actually underneath those numbers, like 20%, 15%, and so on. So maybe you could talk about, for you in your research, what categories do you find most useful in trying to break down and analyze who exactly is being affected by these unemployment or underemployment trends? Is it geography, urban versus rural, class, education, etc.? What is the way that you find most useful for kind of conceptualizing these trends?
Thank you, Andy. Absolutely, as you said, Chinese youth is not a monolithic group. So the cause and consequences of youth unemployment, as well as how it manifests in the contours and rhythms of people's lives, varies dramatically by a host of other social demographic axes. China has seen tremendous educational expansion over the last several decades. So one of the meanings of education, so what does higher education mean nowadays, vary dramatically in the eyes of employers, but also the promises of educational attainment, oftentimes the fruits of educational attainment as a guaranteed way of social mobility, as better career prospects, or as just a general sunnier outlook on life. That fruits are not evenly enjoyed across the population. So one of the most salient axis and one of the most salient dimensions of this inequality is by gender. Urban young adults, especially urban young women, face durable, entrenched, and intensified labor market discriminations and exclusions when they are trying to seek employment. China's labor and family laws is organized around a durable gender essentialist logic that sees women as the primary caregivers that try to guard female reproduction from, for example, quote unquote, dangerous occupations. So all these have implications in the labor market, as in the eyes of the employers, the women are seen as someone that are more distracted by child caring and childbearing responsibilities. And women are seen as less ideal workers, women are seen as less dedicated. So gender becomes one of the key dimensions through which we can understand these differences. And another key dimension would be social class. Social class as it intersects with rural-urban divide. So we have seen a lot of discussions about lying flat. We have also seen a lot of discussions about young adults, quote unquote, self-selecting into wanting to be full-time children. But the precarity that is often come with unemployment and underemployment, and to what extent individuals can have a safety net around that, differ dramatically by one's social class origin. And in the case of China, it differs dramatically by rural-urban divide. So as young adults confront a highly porous social welfare safety net, these kind of inequalities are things that we shall be attuned to as we try to understand youth unemployment in contemporary China.
Right. Yeah, I wonder maybe if you could also give some concrete examples of, how exactly are, you're suggesting those in the countryside might be more affected, or women might be more affected by these trends. Can you give examples maybe of how employers might discriminate against women, or how maybe there's transitions in the different industries in China might be affecting sort of more manual labor, labor intensive workers in the countryside? Is that kind of what you're hinting at?
Yeah, absolutely. I can start with the gender example. So in recent years, China is taking on an increasingly pro-natalist turn with the universal ending of the one-child policy, first as birth quota increased to 2 children for all married heterosexual couples, and now to 3 children. So with expansion in birth quotas, young women are reporting that they're experiencing intensified labor market discrimination as employers are seeing them as going to be having multiple disruptions over the course of their reproductive years. So that's one of the examples that we see how gender manifests.
Right. So maybe we can move on to this question of what has the Chinese government done in response to this? What are the policy responses out there? And I guess, to kind of combine the two questions or combine this kind of ongoing conversation, we could kind of frame this question as two parts. The first is, what do we think are kind of the underlying factors for kind of high unemployment in China? And what has the government done? And do you think the government responses so far are adequate, or if they're inadequate, why are they inadequate? So yeah, for either of you, if you want to kind of begin the conversation, what do you think are sort of the underlying factors to understanding why unemployment kind of persists as being so high, and what can the government, or what has the government been trying to do in response?
I can start. I think Yoon has very helpfully talked about some of the social divides that structure the labor market. So one thing to pay attention to is the gender difference, the rural urban, but kind of class more broadly is a really important a really important way of understanding what's going on. Oftentimes when this gets talked about youth unemployment, people are really just thinking about university grads, and I'll come back to this in a second. This is, I think, influencing the way the government is going about this. But if you look at the unemployment numbers that I was just referencing, they're talking about people in the 16 to 24 age group, and they're not making distinction about their level of education, right? So this is something that's affecting people of various different kinds of class backgrounds. With respect specifically to college graduates, one of the things that's really important, this is something that you just briefly touched on, is the huge expansion of higher education that China has experienced over the past generation. And I think for people outside of China, it's kind of hard to wrap your mind around. So in the year 2000, the gross enrollment rate was 8% in universities, which is to say that 8% of the people that were of appropriate age were enrolling. And by 2020, that number is 54%, right? So in the span of 20 years, this is just a complete reorganization of the whole education system, but also a reorganization of the social system. And the implication there, I think back in 2000, and for the first many years of the 21st century, the implicit understanding is if you can get into university, this is your pathway to a middle class lifestyle, to a white collar job significantly, and to upward socioeconomic mobility. And that promise has become less true over this period of time, in part because of the expansion of higher education. Now, this is not to say that the expansion of higher education is a bad thing, but the question is, how does that large expansion of higher education, and again, that comes along with those specific social expectations about what's going to come afterwards, how does that interface with what's happening in the labor market? And so part of the answer about why you have this high unemployment is that you have, in essence, a glut of people with university degrees, and there are not the kinds of jobs out there that they're expecting to be able to have, that they're just not being created in the same in adequate volumes. Now, Chinese corporations, of course, have been very successful. We've been reading a lot recently about, BYD, the whole EV industry, some of these tech companies. But they're not creating jobs in the volume that is necessary to absorb the literally millions of university graduates that are coming into the labor market every year. Now, on the other end of things, and this is a pretty dramatic simplification, but there's also a kind of a missing middle. So if you look at the research that's been done, especially by Scott Rizal, Natalie Hell, they wrote this book called Invisible China, which I really recommend. One of the things that they find is the dramatic underinvestment in education, particularly in rural areas, and that for rural people, which still, as of their research, constituted almost half of the population, right, that very few people are even finishing high school. Right. And so that means that you have a large segment of the population that is certainly not competing for those white collar jobs, but they're also not necessarily able to fit the kind of the mid-tier kind of technically oriented manufacturing jobs, which China has really been focusing on, right? There's been massive investment in manufacturing over the last several years, and there's going to continue to be. So there's a lot of those jobs that those people who haven't even graduated from high school are also not able to fulfill. And then the university grads are sort of saying to themselves, I want a comfortable office job. And so that I think is part of the explanation. Maybe we can come back to or maybe I'll give you a chance to jump in here and say something about government policy. Yeah.
Yeah, do you want to kind of jump in and kind of what do you see are the big factors and what can the government do or have they done and what do you think the government should do?
Absolutely. Unemployment is and youth unemployment is often the emblematic of a long chain of events about socioeconomic political changes and emblematic of macro level structural issues. So, in terms of what the government is doing or has been doing, one thing to watch was this year in spring, the Central Committee of the Chinese Communist Party and the State Council released a policy document outlining an action plan to boost consumption. And as we read through this action plan, two things jump out. One is throughout this document, there's the continued emphasis of work, of employment, of basically working hard. But at the same time, as it is often the case with these kind of documents, is there's a very opaque and very ambivalent actual implementation. So one of the things that has been talked about lately is the government subsidies that are trying to boost domestic consumption. But the problem is, as we think about it, as we think about the organizations and arrangement of the central-local relationship in China, where does the money come from? Especially as local governments are deeply embroiled in mounting debt. And for example, in the special action items, and when you talked about encouraging employment, then talking about improving employment conditions, the question is that who are going to enforce that, especially as labor organizations in China in recent years have been under continued assault. So in many ways, as we think about what the government can do or what the government is doing, there is this tremendous disjuncture between the policy and action items on paper vis-a-vis those that are practical and accessible in practice.
If I could just add one thing on this. So one of the things that's also been discussed since the spring from the central government is subsidies to companies to hire university grads. And so some of the same problems, and this is really, I think, essential to the organization of the Chinese state, right, where the central government puts out these big policy frameworks, and then the question about how to finance it is up to the local governments. And I think right now, just to underline what Yoon's already said, we should have less confidence that the local governments have the capacity to do that. With respect to, so there's the what's happening on the consumption side. On the employment side, they've been talking about having these subsidies to companies to hire university graduates. And again, this is unobjectionable, but I think also underlines a kind of bias in the employment policy towards those university graduates and not towards the more working class, rural people who are, they're not sort of calling for subsidies to hire those folks.
Yeah. It sounds like maybe there is, we're kind of come back to this question about unevenness that Yuan was mentioning earlier, which is that maybe these subsidy policies are sort of one size fits all solutions. Just kind of give subsidies to hire more people. But depending on the industry, right, certain industries might be hiring like the high tech industries and so on. But China, for a variety of reasons, right, the kind of more labor intensive manufacturing jobs have kind of plateaued or begun to shrink in recent years for geopolitical reasons, technology reasons, and so on. From what it sounds like from both of you is that the government is kind of encouraging companies or individuals to take the initiative to kind of overcome this unemployment problem, but really the underlying factors are much bigger than that. They're much more structural. They're national. They're international. They're having to do with economic forces. Is kind of a fair characterization? There's sort of disproportion between the solutions and the problems.
So if we look at Xi's speeches and emphasis in recent years, we do see this emphasis on the embracement of hardship, or literal translation of eating bitterness, that encouraging young adults to not lie flat, to encourage young adults to work. But the issue is as we envision how a society organized, as we envision what would be a ideal future, and as these young adults aspire to certain kind of their places in the world and their places in the future, the current policies are really emphasizing on production, and again, social welfare safety net remains largely porous, and especially for the rural population. So in terms of for young adults, as they aspire to their place in the world, these are young adults coming of age during and after COVID lockdown, where the sense of personal freedoms, the sense of safety are under assault. And these are individuals that are grapple with mounting precarity that are driven by both murky geopolitical tensions, but also by uncertain political futures. So this sense of precarity are deeply ingrained in how young adults make decisions, especially as they aspire to what kind of futures that they want to have.
I would just add something. So this phrase that's kind of re-entered popular discourse around taking off the scholar's robes in Chinese, 脱下长衫, which is like is something that you've seen government officials saying. I don't know if Xi himself has actually said, but it's this thing that they have said to university grads to essentially don't be too choosy, right? You have these scholars robes from graduating university. You thought you were going to get this fancy job, and you should go out and take a job in a factory. You should, set up a stall on the side of the street, whatever it is. So young people do not like this, not surprisingly. But I think that it reveals a kind of deeper and structural problem, which is it's not simply that there are not enough jobs, although I think that that is true. There's also the question of the quality of the jobs and the relationship between the quality of the job and the kind of life that people are expecting. So if in order to get the kind of the basic things that you need to live a life in the city, to maybe get married, to buy a house, to buy a car, to pay for children's education, et cetera, the kind of job that you might need to get in order to do that might be so soul crushing, right? With the famous 996 work schedule, that you might feel like you have to give up other things that you wanted from life. For instance, like a relationship with your partner, seeing your children frequently, these kinds of things. And so as those things have gotten more expensive, especially the cost of housing, right? People kind of feel like maybe I don't want to take that kind of job and do that to my life in order to get those sorts of things, right? So that's kind of an evaluation I think that many people have articulated. You can also see it though. This is not just a university grad phenomenon, I think. And here I want to give a shout out to a PhD student here at Cornell, a guy named Zhuang Han, who's doing research on the so-called Sanhe gods in Shenzhen, this is the kind of a cultural phenomenon that appeared a few years ago. Sanhe refers to this labor market in Shenzhen. And these are kind of working class, rural to urban migrants who come to the city and work the absolute minimum, right? They're working just like they'll work one day and then they'll just like play video games for 3 days. They eat nothing but kind of instant noodles, and they have no aspirations to get married, to buy a house, any of these things. I mean, these are stereotypes, but it refers to a real thing. And what he shows in his research is that for these working class people, they've also kind of done the math. Like, what are the things that I would need to do to live a kind of a socially valorized lifestyle? And what are the jobs that are out there? And how much would I have to work in order to be able to get some of those things for, house, car, et cetera? And it just feels completely out of reach for them. And so I think at the kind of the cultural level, there's now enough people who've made that evaluation that they can sort of say, well, I'm just going to withdraw from the labor market as much as possible, except to meet the kind of like very, very basic sorts of needs. And so it takes different kinds of manifestations, I think, for working class migrants than it does for university graduates, but you can see similar sorts of dynamics, I think, on both sides.
Yeah, so it does sound like from both of you that the problem is much larger and it's kind of rooted in these kind of bigger impersonal forces, whereas the government's response has tend to be around kind of personal solutions or personal kind of diagnoses, right? Like you have to work harder, take off the scholar's robe, and so on. So for right now, at least, it seems that as if the policy responses are a little bit inadequate. So maybe we could end by asking this question, if these policy responses remain inadequate, if this problem persists and continues to kind of mark an entire generation or several generations of young people in China, does this have larger political ramifications in China? Will this somehow chip away at the legitimacy of the government and of the party? We don't want to get too carried away, but like in general, like, have we begun to see that the party is concerned about what could happen if several generations of people in China just remain kind of jaded and disillusioned with the material and social promises that the party is delivering. Yeah, either one of you wants to start there.
We can start. Certainly, there are political implications, but the political implications might not always go in the direction that we assume it will go. One of the interesting trend that we are observing on the ground in China is there's rising aspirations for public sector jobs. There are rising aspirations for civil service jobs. There are rising aspirations for state-owned enterprises jobs. So we almost see a closer entanglement between young adults and the state. And you see a closer not necessarily emotional bonding, but certainly a transactional logic that individuals try to bind themselves to the state, in that these are the jobs that provide security, these are the jobs that provide relatively higher prestige, that these are the jobs that provide relatively better welfare provisions. So, in this sense, in which direction might the political implication go remains quite an open-ended question. And over the past several years, we have seen these young adults are, for some, there's this awakening in that previously it has the assumption has been that as long as one stays relatively further away from politics, there is a sense of personal freedom and there's a sense of personal security that can be guaranteed. And COVID, zero COVID governance, and the a capricious reopening afterwards for a lot of young adults shattered that illusion. So where do young adults emerge from this? Do they emerge and transform into a paradoxically closer an entanglement with the state? That's an interesting possibility to watch.
This point about increasing focus on the civil service, on state-owned enterprises is really, really important and is quite a noticeable shift, I would say, over the last 10 years. And what that reveals, I think, is people are looking for shelter from the market, and they're looking for shelter from involution, right? Is this term that people have used to refer to this intensifying competition in education, in jobs, longer hours, in the sense that no matter how hard you work, you can't really get ahead. And so that the taking the civil service exam, trying to get a job in a state-owned enterprise, that's a way kind of out of that, where you can have somewhat normal working hours, where you might not earn as much money as you will in the private sector, but you have greater stability. The problem, though, is that there's limited employment opportunities, right? And especially now that we see local governments under this kind of fiscal crunch, they're not massively expanding it, right? So the kind of the state apportioned employment system controlled by the central government, there's not going to be a massive expansion. And so we've actually seen a shift in this involution, this kind of involutionary competition from the market to preparing for the civil service exam, right? And you have actually an entire industry that's built up around prepping students for the civil service exam, and those companies are making a lot of money. And so, for the people who can get in, I absolutely agree, is bringing them closer to the state. But there's a kind of a limited demographic that can do that. And so the question is, I think, what happens to those people who don't get in, who are still subjected to these intense market competition? You can look at what's happening in China's leading industries like EV right now. I mean, the competition is absolutely cutthroat, even for people who can get employment. And so one of the responses that a lot of people have kind of had, at least at the cultural level, is this idea of kind of lying flat, of wanting to check out. Now, in terms of what does this mean politically, I don't think that this poses like a direct, threat to Communist Party rule or anything like that, because they're not organizing politically. It's very hard to organize politically, even in places where there's more political space. Unemployed people are famously like not that potent a political force, except in a couple of exceptional situations. And so, but I think the fact that it's got such purchase at the cultural level is really significant of this underlying issue. I think that the threat, and this is one that the state sees very clearly, is not a kind of a frontal attack on the state and revolutionary politics or anything like that, but it is this kind of like, this Bartleby-like lack of enthusiasm and foot dragging and not wanting to really struggle and eat bitterness to help China's companies develop, so that they can compete on the global marketplace. And I think that kind of that passive and very individualized form of resistance is already happening. It's something that the state is very concerned about. But as with this question of like the falling fertility rate, they don't have that many levers that they can use to kind of at the individual level conjure more more energy to work harder. And that is really a very significant generational shift from the way things were for their parents.
Great. And well, not great, but great analysis. Maybe if one of you could just kind of take this question, where do we see this trend headed given the current situation of a sort of, uh, economic, Cold War between kind of ramping up, with the Trump administration, and tariffs and all this stuff. Can't be good news. But do either of you have a sense of, have we already begun to see how this is affecting unemployment, or what sectors of China where would unemployment be most affected?
In the short term, the tension between US China will certainly dampen or certainly cast an adverse effect on the labor market, especially in sectors that are deeply dependent on trade, on China's export. But it's also important to keep in mind that the entanglement between US China has been going on for the last 40 years, and a complete decoupling is rather it's a tall order. So as we envision what the future holds, it's sometimes interesting to see if it's sometimes important to see if we want to take a what the time scale under which that we want to consider. And sociologists are not necessarily the best ones to make predictions, as the discipline has told us.
Right.
But in terms of US-China relations, I think another important aspect to watch is people's sentiments on the ground, both in the US and in China, about what kind of aspirations and what kind of places that we want to have in the world. And again, that returns to our beginning of the conversation that Chinese youth are not a monolithic group, and the hopes that they have and the aspirations they hold certainly vary.
Yeah. Great.
Yeah.
Uh,
So, I mean, just very briefly, I think the thing that people were most concerned about was the immediate impact on these export-oriented companies. And the latest data shows that China's exports continue to go up, that those exports are going to other parts of the world. That's creating tensions in other places. So there hasn't been that kind of immediate shock that some people thought might have happened. I think kind of at the more political level, right? The question is if you're going to be subordinating the interests of workers or particular groups to kind of a national interest, that does not create a positive environment for advancing the interests of workers, either in the United States or China, because in both places, you can have the government essentially saying, well, we can't pay the workers more, or we can't allow them to have unions or anything. The main thing we have to do is to have these companies be as competitive as possible so that we can beat China, or China will say so that we can beat the United States, and that is not, a propitious environment for improving the situation for workers.
Okay, great. So this is a wonderful, rich, complex conversation. Thank you so much to both of you for giving viewers so much to digest. And yeah, thanks so much for the conversation. And you'll give us a lot to think about as we kind of follow these trends in the next few years.